Today we are looking at a case from the mid-20th century, so sit back as we go to Japan. Sadamichi Hirasawa was born in Tokyo on February the 18th, 1892. But when he was just 5 years old, his parents moved to the port city of Otaru, which looks out onto the Sea of Japan from the island of Hokkaido. While still at primary school, his teachers noticed that he was very gifted at drawing and painting and tried to encourage him to paint as often as possible. He soon started to win art competitions, and his paintings were exhibited in prestigious galleries. As he grew up, he became a more established figure, and following his marriage, he moved to Tokyo to take up a position as a teacher in an art academy. He went on to have 5 children and was described as a thoughtful and honourable gentleman who was happiest when painting. He lived relatively well until Japan entered the Second World War in September 1940, when life in Japan suddenly changed. At the end of the war, the country emerged with a severely damaged infrastructure, a weak economy, and food shortages. Allied forces occupied the country, and in 1947, a new constitution was introduced, which brought about many changes. The emperor became a symbol of the state and no longer had political power. Large companies were broken up, and land reform was introduced, which led to land being distributed to poorer tenant farmers rather than belonging to powerful landowners. The immediate years after the war were very difficult for the Japanese people, but this was followed by a long period of major growth and an incredible economic recovery. On January the 26th, 1948, a gentleman entered a branch of the Imperial Bank in the Tokyo suburb of Shinamashi. It was mid-afternoon, and for the staff the day had been just like any other Monday. The gentleman looked just like any other regular customer. He was wearing loosely fitting clothes and a long coat. However, one of the staff noticed that he was also wearing an armband, which suggested he was a government official. He asked to speak to the manager and explained that he was an epidemiologist who was employed by the Public Health Department. He said that he had been sent by the American authorities, who at the time were running the country, and he was required to inoculate the bank staff against an outbreak of dysentery which had occurred in the local area. This was quite believable, as since the end of the war, the authorities had set up a public health and welfare department and instructed the Ministry of Health to take responsibility for the well-being of the Japanese people. Many diseases had been prevalent in the country. In 1947, murine typhus, cholera, typhoid fever, tuberculosis and dysentery had all contributed to civilian deaths. A lot of this was due to poor hygiene and sanitation, predominantly because of a lack of infrastructure in the cities, following the damage inflicted during the war years. So when the gentleman entered the bank, claiming to be a public health official, it seemed quite reasonable that the Ministry of Health would have sent him. On this particular Monday, there were 14 people working in the bank, and 2 children were waiting for a parent to take them home. The gentleman asked the manager to close early and to gather the staff. He reassured them that this was an easy cure, as it did not involve an injection. Instead, it could be ingested. The man then put a liquid into 16 small glasses, mixing it with Japanese tea, and requested that all the staff simultaneously drink it. Some of them said that it burnt their throats, and within a few minutes, all of the staff dropped to the floor in excruciating pain, although 1 or 2 did manage to make it to the bathroom. The gentleman then calmly collected money from the cashier's tills, and without a fuss, he left the building. He escaped with 160,000 yen, which was the equivalent to about $2,000 at the time. 1 staff member managed to raise the alarm, and the police soon arrived. They found 10 people dead, and 6 more extremely poorly. They immediately arranged for them to be taken to a nearby hospital, where shortly after arriving, 2 more died. The police ordered that a post-mortem be conducted on the deceased, and it was discovered that the cause of death had been cyanide poisoning. They interviewed the 4 surviving victims to try and get a description of the man who had committed the terrible crime, but they were unable to provide a comprehensive idea of exactly what the perpetrator looked like. The police had very little to go on, as the gentleman had just walked out of the building and disappeared. When this unknown assailant had entered the bank, he spoke to the manager and gave him a business card with the name Shigeru Matsui. The business card seemed to be all the police had to go on. They contacted the Ministry of Health and were surprised to discover that a gentleman by the name did actually work there. Detectives interviewed Shigeru Matsui, but soon realised that he was not the person responsible for the crime. Matsui, however, was able to tell the police that he had exchanged business cards with 593 people. The exchanging of business cards is very important in Japan and used as a formal and respectful introduction to someone, and Matsui had all the business cards he had received. The police now had 593 possible suspects and set out to contact them. As news of the crime was reported, the investigators learned of 2 similar occurrences that had happened in other Tokyo banks in the weeks prior to the 26th of January. On both occasions, a man had entered the bank and informed the staff that he was from the Ministry of Health. He had said that due to an outbreak of dysentery, he would have to inoculate them all. However, both these attempts failed. The banks were busy with customers and both branches were short-staffed, as employees were absent due to illness. This meant that it was not possible to get all the staff together at the same time. Rather than wait, the person claiming to be from the Ministry of Health just left and said that he would come back another time, but he never returned. The police undertook the task of tracing all 593 people whose business cards Matsui had given them. This was long and arduous work, but they slowly managed to eliminate each person until they were left with just one suspect, the artist, Sadamichi Hirasawa. They visited his home, where on August the 21st, 1948, some 7 months after the incident, they arrested him and took him to the police station to be questioned. Hirasawa denied that he had anything to do with the events that took place at the Imperial Bank. Some of the police officers also wondered if this mild-mannered gentleman was capable of pulling off such a crime. They did, however, continue to look into his background, his financial situation, and his whereabouts on the previous 26th of January, and they made some very interesting discoveries. He had previously been questioned by the police for attempting to cash checks in Tokyo banks using incorrect names and addresses. The police also noted that he had deposited 130,000 yen into his account on the day of the robbery. They asked him how he came to be in possession of such a large amount of cash, but Hirasawa refused to tell them. They also asked him to produce a business card that he had been given by Dr. Shigeru Matsui, but he was unable to do it. He told the investigators that he had been pickpocketed the previous summer and his wallet, which contained the card, had been stolen. The police presented him to the 4 survivors of the robbery and to other witnesses who were in the bank when the gentleman had entered. However, only 2 were able to say that they thought Hirasawa was the man responsible. Despite intense police interrogation, he refused to admit that he had committed the crime. But the police kept on interviewing him. They started to make these interviews last a lot longer. They became repetitive, and they kept him in a small cell at night, only to wake him up and interview him again. Eventually, under the immense pressure from the detectives, he admitted that he was the person responsible for the crime at the Imperial Bank and signed a confession. The police had their man, and Sadamichi Hirasawa was charged with robbery and murder. The trial started in Tokyo on the 20th of December 1948, and Hirasawa pleaded not guilty. He had already retracted his confession, and his defense team told the court that the defendant suffered from Korsakoff syndrome. This is a disorder that primarily affects the memory system in the brain. They said this syndrome, together with the fact that his confession had been coerced, meant that it was not reliable. It was known that Hirasawa's art was not selling well at the time. The war and subsequent years had meant that money was scarce in Japan, and there were far less customers wanting to buy his paintings. But he had money stored at his house and in his bank, far more than an art teacher would ever have. So the detectives asked him how he had come to have such a large amount of cash. Hirasawa, however, refused to say where the money had come from. The handwriting on the cheque that had been cashed following the incident had been checked against the defendant's handwriting, and it was concluded that it did not match. Hirasawa's fingerprints were also not found at the crime scene. The defence produced witnesses who said that the defendant was out walking when the incident took place. Other witnesses vouched for his good character. The trial lasted for 17 months, and on the 24th of July, 1950, Sadamichi Hirasawa was found guilty and sentenced to death. Following the trial and the guilty verdict, people started to question if Hirasawa was indeed guilty. The police had not really investigated his claim that his wallet had been stolen, or other possible sources of income he may have had. One theory emerged that he had cash in his house, because as his art wasn't selling, he started to paint indecent and lewd pictures, which, if he had admitted, would have severely damaged his reputation as an artist. An appeal was launched, and the defence applied for a retrial. However, this was denied. But unlike other prisoners who had been sentenced to death in Japan, the sentence passed down to Sadamichi Hirasawa was not carried out. He just remained in prison and continued to plead his innocence. Questions were raised as to how a painter would have been able to get hold of such a large amount of cyanide and organise such a robbery. Many people thought that it all seemed too convenient to convict Hirasawa and believed that the incident may have been carried out by the military or someone with a military background. As doubts over his guilt increased, the Japanese public sent him painting equipment, and while in prison, he painted many pictures. So many, in fact, that the art he produced while waiting for his execution was displayed at a Tokyo art gallery. Lawyers continued to campaign for a retrial, but each time this was dismissed. But still, Hirasawa's sentence was not carried out. Instead, he just stayed in prison and painted. On the 10th of May 1987, Sadamichi Hirasawa died in prison, where he had been for nearly 40 years. He was 95 years old and proclaimed his innocence to the end. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I will see you in the next brief case